Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of humanist writers during the Renaissance, right? Now, we're going in a lot of really interesting directions in this flip. We're going to be talking about, the perspectives of women. We're going to be talking about, our first, tippy toes into the Northern Renaissance, talking about how it's going to be expanding and doing some different little things like that, going, up into the northern regions, into France and the Holy Roman Empire, and how it's now just kind of beginning to break the borders outside of Italy, right? We're going to talk about a couple other writers and some Christian humanism. We're going to talk about a very famous female Renaissance writer at the time, but after that, we're going to be kind of wrapping up all of our humanist writers, okay? Which I know for a high schooler is really intense stuff, all right? It's pretty hard to get super stoked about this guy, Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli, though, is extremely important when you're talking about somebody who wrote a massive text that is going to shape, alter, and change the direction of history. His book, The Prince, after, that crazy monk Savonarola took over Florence for a little while, ran out the Medicis, and then the Medicis came back, and then, of course, arrested this guy because he was just doing his job. Literally, the whole, process is going to create that work known as The Prince, right? All that stuff that lead up to it is important. And the other big thing about it is the message of The Prince is very important. What was he trying to ask? What is, the biggest thing about it is he's talking about that civic humanism, the art of creating a great government, right? That is a very humanist perspective, just exactly like Grace Wilson kind of ended us off with talking about in class. It's look, we're focusing on our here and now, right? Because our government is not going to help lead us to heaven and stuff like that. Well, I mean, it theoretically could, but more along the ideas of it's not a direct involvement. And he's trying to figure out what government's going to be best for us all, because it's obviously not these Medici that tortured him and did all this other stuff and then kicked him out of Florence, his hometown, for the rest of his life. He actually even based, now this is a really interesting thing, speaking of how you probably didn't want your church and your government at the time, he actually even based the entire story, Machiavelli we're talking about here, of course, based the entire story off this guy named Rodrigue Borgia, right? And Rodrigue Borgia was actually, Rodrigue Borgia is Alexander VI. Okay, so really quick, okay? There was a pope at the time named Alexander VI, okay? When Machiavelli was around and doing his writings and stuff like that, one of the popes known as Alexander VI was a really corrupt dude, right? Very corrupt, very intense, and what he ends up doing is he actually has an illegitimate son, right? And his illegitimate child, okay, yeah, there we go, yeah. So his illegitimate child, okay, which means he had him out of wedlock and stuff like that, his name's Caesar Borgia, right? So Rodrigue Borgia, his father, being Pope Alexander VI, is going to have this child, and he actually, Caesar, is a pretty ruthless guy. He's a pretty intense ruler. He, does everything he has to do for his state. He believes that it is better to be feared and loved, and that's who Machiavelli based the entire book off of. Now, what am I getting at with this, though? Why am I talking about a pope, his son, and how Machiavelli based an entire book off the pope's illegitimate son, who is a ruthless and intense and crass ruler? Well, the thing about it is we're now starting to realize is that there's some fishy stuff going on in the church, right? Christian morals are kind of a little bit out of whack during the Italian Renaissance, or during the Renaissance in general, and that we're going to need to see, or we're going to heavily see, humanism begin to mix with the church, okay? So when the humanism and the church begin to kind of mix together, you're now getting new perspectives and new criticisms of the church that have never been seen before. You're also getting more criticisms of Christian morals. Where does that stand up in society? Are they a good thing? Are they a bad thing? Should we be basing our laws off Christian morals? Have we derivated our way away? Or have we derivated so far away from the Christian teachings that it's kind of corrupted society in a really big way? And the interesting thing about it is that these are our first two Northern Renaissance writers, okay? Everybody we've been talking about up to this point is an Italian Renaissance writer. So now what we're getting into now, when I say Northern Renaissance writer, I mean that means that they live in countries outside of Italy, right? They live in countries that are a little bit further north. For example, the first guy we're going to talk about is English, right? And then the next guy that we're going to talk about is Flemish, or you would consider him Dutch. All right, so so the first guy, though, let's go ahead and get it started off with, is going to be talking about religious code and morals, and his name is Sir Thomas More, our English philosopher, our first Northern Renaissance figure, okay? So we have our Italian Renaissance and our Northern Renaissance, and a big thing that we'll talk about tomorrow, because we're going to look at a bunch of pretty stuff on a Friday, and it's going to be great. I'm going to bring y'all some snacks and stuff like that. We're just going to sit in the floor and look at paintings and stuff and talk about how pretty they are. Now, the big thing about it, though, is Sir Thomas More, that English philosopher that actually was there, was a big part of this Northern Renaissance movement. His writing style is key different from Italian Renaissance, and there's just as much as paintings and sculptures from the Northern era were very, very key different from Italian Renaissance work as well. Now, talking about all this stuff, you also have to understand that Sir Thomas More, being that English philosopher, had a very, very storied career. Rose really, really quickly through the ranks, but before he ever even got there, he was a very famous writer. He ended up, because of the works that we're about to talk about right now, because of the main book that he wrote, he actually ended up getting a lot of, fame and acclaim, and he rose through the ranks and became what is known as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, being the Archbishop of Canterbury means that literally he was one of the leading guides and actually ecclesiastical ministers for the king at the time, a very, very famous king by the name of Henry VIII. Now, some of y'all have probably heard of Henry VIII before. He is the one that had 6 different wives and had 2 of them executed, right? We'll talk about him when we get to the Reformation, because he's going to start his own new church whenever he actually wants to go off and get a divorce from his wife and then marry this other person named Anne Boleyn, which, fun fact, will end up leading to Sir Thomas More's death, right? Because actually, King Henry VIII did execute him. Now, the thing that made Sir Thomas More, though, famous as a writer is the Utopia. He wrote this very, very famous book called the Utopia in 1516, and what it is, or what the premise of it is the idea that he's basing or trying to do exactly what Plato did as well. Plato wrote a very famous book known as the Republic when he was alive, when he was in ancient Greece, and it was all about creating the perfect state, right? Now, in Plato's Republic, though, things were a little bit different in the sense where it's the family had been completely gotten rid of, and a lot of different things were heavily changed, and there weren't major distinctions between people, and private property was borderline neutralized. But the thing about it, though, is that Plato was a very, very, very intense philosopher from the Greek era, and the humanists of the Renaissance loved him, and they loved to bring up his works and kind of redo them. Whereas Aristotle was a little bit more of kind of the Middle Ages philosopher, the late Middle Ages, when the Renaissance was beginning to revive and have breath breathed back into his lungs again. So Plato stuff starts coming around. You got Ficino translating it. You got the allegory of the cave that we talked about in class, right? The theory of forms. Well, Sir Thomas More takes the idea of the Republic, right? The idea of the perfect state by Plato, and he tries to create one of his own, right? And he takes place on an island away from Europe. And on this island, or in this entire book, there's this character known as Raphael. And Raphael is touring this island, but he's being led on this tour by all these different figures that actually lead this island. And most of them are ministers and priests that are actually the people that are in charge of enforcing a Christian moral code. Now, the thing that we have to understand is that a lot of things that were happening in society during this time period don't line up with the Bible very, very well, because the Bible says a lot of really, really important things. For example, one of the biggest things Christ lashed out against was people hoarding wealth, right? Hoarding wealth, hoarding private property and stuff like that. There's a very famous line in the Bible where Christ apparently said, "It is easier to pass a camel through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven," right? So what Sir Thomas More is trying to do is trying to take things like that, ideas from the Bible itself, and apply it to the real world. So he creates this fictitious island that actually is far away from Europe, and it actually has a little picture of it and stuff like that. And I'll go ahead and pull it up real fast. So yeah, there's a picture of it right here. There's a map of it and everything like that, and it has the entire setup, shows where everyone lives, how you can get to it. And the thing about it, though, is unfortunately it's just not real. So getting into it, though, also, every child got a great education for free, because it was believed that by the biblical codes that all children deserved said education. Adults spent their days laboring, and then in the evenings they would study classic Greek literature, how Renaissance of you, and then also poverty completely fixed, because private property was abolished, right? Private property was completely abolished, and everyone shared communal fields and actually worked together for the sustainment of the society itself. It actually, interestingly enough, sounds like a little bit, socialist. Sounds a little bit something like communism a little bit, right? So you could argue that this is kind of one of those early viewpoints of that entire premise. Now, the next couple of slides, don't write them down. Listen to me carefully. Don't write them down. Don't write the next couple of slides. You don't need to. It's just kind of little interesting facts about the Utopia and stuff like that also kind of went a little bit further with it. But the thing about it is that the book was written as criticism. It was written as a criticism of the fact that he was believing that the church had begun to go astray, and that it wasn't taking care of its people anymore. It was becoming obsessed with things like wealth and private property, and also not regulating the people that were actually ruling over others and trying to make sure that people got the best life and that they were living here. You see, that's the interesting thing about it, is Sir Thomas More is trying to take Christianity Christianity and humanism and mush them together, which you would think that the two don't go together. You'd think it's almost like oil and water, that they would never actually see eye to eye. But he's trying to say that we can use Christian moral code to live a better life in a place like the utopia, right? So going on it too as well, he heavily criticized the death penalty. Now, this is another thing that he shared with one of his best friends, and we'll talk about that guy here in literally like 2 seconds. Criticized the death penalty and this thing called the enclosure system that was popping up at the time. He was actually super anti-death penalty to the point where he's like, why are we burning people at the stake? The Bible doesn't say to do that. It doesn't say to torch heretics and burn them mercilessly. It just says to kind of let them, get rid of them. Just send them out, right? And that's an interesting premise of the utopia. It being an island, you can easily just banish someone if you need to from the perfect society, right? Utopia is also painted as a perfect place with like no locked doors, a redistributed population. But the interesting thing, though, too, at the same time, or on the same note, every house has 2 slaves in Utopia, and they use gold on the chains to bind the slaves, and their toilets are made of gold as well, because they don't need money anymore. But the slaves are actually people that had committed crimes in Utopia, because premarital sex was like punished with celibacy, and then also adultery was punished with enslavement, right? So the other thing about it is weird. This one was interesting that I've never been able to wrap my head around. He also said that euthanasia would be allowed in like the utopia. Now, I think the idea here is he's beginning to be satirical, right? Now, my interpretation of it when I read it was that he's trying to now show kind of to an extent that we can't stretch the use of biblical attitudes too far, right? If we go too far, things start getting kind of like very, very wishy-washy. And we start, like enslaving people and then also, like allowing euthanasia, right? So religious tolerance as well is accepted, and everyone on the island, whether they be Christian or not, just has to abide by the moral codes that are, ironically enough, set up in the Christian text. But that's the utopia, right? And it's a satirical work. It's using Plato's ideas, which makes it humanist and makes it Renaissance, right? Now, going into it though as well, this guy is one of Sir Thomas More's best friends. Literally, one of his best buddies. They talk to each other all the time. They send each other letters. I bet they giggled and stuff like that. And it was a whole big thing. Now, look, going into it, though, in general, his name is Desiderius Erasmus. He is Flemish or Dutch at the time. I love the Dutch. And as you know, for anybody that comes this summer, we will be going to the Netherlands, right? And going to Amsterdam. It's going to be a great time. Now, the big thing about it, though, when we're talking about it, one of the biggest things about this guy is he is a multifaceted individual. He has a very, very famous text we'll talk about at the end of this. But the interesting thing about him is he takes a very humanist view of Christianity in the sense where he's saying to himself, we have began to derivate too far. We have began to kind of create an established church that is hoarding on to the intelligence and hoarding on to the property and hoarding on to the ethical views of people's lives and using it more like a leash rather than using it like a guide, right? And so one of the biggest things that he comes out with is he says that all versions of the Bible should be translated into vernacular text, which means that they should be translated into languages that people can read. And he did it. He violated church law and he did it on his own and he translated it into Greek, right? And so another thing about it as well is he said that we need to stop looking at Christianity and Catholicism like it's this hierarchy of people and that we can the wealthier you are, the higher you will be because you're donating to the church. We need to advocate more for a childlike view of Christianity. Y'all remember when you were little and you were just believed the things given to you no matter what. If someone said this thing is true, you were just like, oh, that makes sense, right? And you would try to do the right thing and have morals and stuff like that. You felt guilt probably a little bit more often when you were a child. He's advocating for that as well. He also wanted all biblical texts published in the vernacular language, which I just said 2 seconds ago. And then also education, he said, would lead to reform. He said everyone deserves an education as according to Scripture. And then also, if you are going to do anything negative to a person, there better be some scriptural text based on it. One of the biggest things he would agreed with Sir Thomas More about, and they have several letters back and forth to each other about, is he's the same thing. He's like, why are we killing people? If there's a heretic who doesn't believe in the Bible, we can just not listen to him and we can just tell him to leave. We don't have to kill that person, right? We don't have to burn them alive. And he actually looked upon what the church was doing in crime and punishment as being super negative and very, very disgusting. And the other thing he said, though, is we educate people, it will reform everything, and that our Christianity is not a checklist for life. We're not sitting there going oh, our sacrament, 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 now I get into heaven. He said, instead, you need to live a good life that will earn you right and passage into heaven the way that you want it to, right? So the other thing about it, though, is he also wrote another very famous book. Change up scenery. I know that was a little bit weird, but I was actually downstairs in the faculty workroom just now doing that whole thing. It was really, really early in the morning, so if I seemed a little bit low intensity, my bad. But anyway, so let's get right back into it. Keep talking about all this stuff because I know big fans of I know Carissa and Chloe Arnold and all these other awesome kids in this AP class really, really want to know more about Erasmus. Not really. I know you don't, and it's okay. I don't even really like talking about him that much, except this part, all right? So, I do like talking about Erasmus and Sir Thomas More for one particular reason. A book that Erasmus also wrote, and then also on top of that, I also really like to talk about this thing called the Republic of Letters, right? Now, this right here is going to be probably the most important two pieces of information on this entire slide. So, The Praise of Folly is a book that Erasmus wrote that was a heavy criticism of the church. So, the entire book is actually recorded or written as kind of like a metaphorical person, right? So folly is like silliness or accidents or kind of going down the wrong road intentionally kind of stuff. And so the idea, though, is he wrote this book as if Folly was a person, right? And Folly was literally a woman, and she kind of is just commenting on everything going on in society. And one of the big things that she actually comments on is how she is present at all talks about religion these days, right? So a big thing that Erasmus is trying to get at is he's trying to say that the church is beginning to go wayward, right? It's beginning to become much more of a political entity and less of a religious, less of a guide to people's lives and more of a political entity and almost more like a business. And the big thing about it is The Praise of Folly spread really, really quickly. And we're going to talk about why it spread really, really quickly here in about 2 seconds. But the biggest thing that you need to understand is that The Praise of Folly was a criticism of the church. It was also a satirical criticism of society in general and how we needed to do exactly what Sir Thomas More said in the Utopia and get back to those Christian morals and stuff like that to try and get society back on the right track because it had derivated so heavily away from the rational understanding of creating perfect societies like Plato had always thought about, right? Now, going into it as well, though, speaking of the fact that Erasmus and St. Thomas or Sir Thomas More were really, really tight, really, really good friends. I'm not even kidding, knew each other really well, wrote letters to each other back and forth all the time. But there's an interesting concept about the Renaissance you need to also understand. This thing right here is so important that the AP group chat on their text message was called this, all right? So the Republic of Letters, and those kids did really, really well on the AP test, but they called it the Republic of Letters because basically that's what it was. It was like a group chat, right? So Sir Thomas More would write letters to Erasmus with his thoughts and ideas on the Utopia. Erasmus would critique it and send it back with ideas for The Praise of Folly. And then they might send it to another friend. And the thing about it was the Republic of Letters is actually made up of hundreds of different Renaissance writers that kind of pinged ideas back and forth off of each other all the time, right? The Republic of Letters is a really, really important thing because it's showing us that not only is Renaissance intelligence growing and that humanism breaking the bounds of what it used to be, but now it's also intellectuals communicating, collaborating, and making even better ideas. Now, speaking of one individual in particular that actually was really, really important, this is one of my favorite things that actually Erasmus ever did, and he actually got the idea from the Republic of Letters, some dialogue that he had going back and forth between him and several other people that were involved. And actually, the picture is a little bit hard to see, but what it is, it's an engraving from a book that he actually did. So remember we talked about in class, Julius II, the Pope that actually paid Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling? He actually died before the ceiling was completely finished. I believe he died in 1513 or 1512. I have to look that up. But the thing about it, though, is he actually dies, and after his death, Erasmus wrote a little short story saying that Julius is going to be excluded from heaven and that he had to stand out front of the gates of heaven. Even though he had the keys that Peter had, he had to stand out front with a list of the things that he had done wrong. So again, Erasmus commenting on the corruption of the church and how things have been getting really, really dicey. But speaking of the Republic of Letters, let's talk about somebody that wasn't in the main Republic of Letters because she's a woman. So I think it's really, really important to also talk really briefly, or not really briefly, I think it's really, really important to talk about women's roles as humanists in society. There's a thing that you need to understand is that many of these Renaissance humanists that we've talked about already literally thought that women were not capable of participating in the Renaissance, which is big pile of steaming garbage, and it's absolutely not true. For example, Alberti, right? So Leonardo Alberti, the guy that was the Renaissance man, and actually did all the cryptography, architecture, the geometric patterns and stuff, one of the JV humanists, he actually said that women's main roles were in servile positions, like serving food, cooking, and cleaning, right? Which is absolutely ridiculous because this woman bucked back against that. Her name was Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan is a very famous female vernacular writer from the Renaissance period. She's probably the most famous out of all of them. And her works went on to inspire other famous women from the Renaissance, to get out there and actually exert their power and seek out an education, right? Because Christine Pizan wrote a very famous book known as the Book of the City of the Ladies, right? Or no, is that or the Book of City Ladies? I'm going to look that up and double check it, but go ahead and write this title down for now. But basically, Christine Pizan wrote the Book of City Ladies, what actually is a contradiction to a lot of what other humanists thought. She basically used her literary abilities to make money, and she was a scribe and actually wrote a bunch of this different stuff for people as a part of her job to earn enough money to then write her own book. And in this other book, it was a contradiction or a contration to all the stuff the other humanists said about women. And she said, the only reason that you think that we are subservient to you is because we have not received the same education that men had. Look at me. Look at me using my abilities and skills to write, to make money, and be a part of this economy, and also to come up with my own thoughts and feelings. Because you know what? Educated women will make educated children, and society will progress better because of it. I love me some Christine Pizan. It's very, very important. Now, the big thing about it, though, is the Book of City Ladies, okay? Praise of Folly, the Utopia, all that good stuff spread through the Renaissance very, very quickly. And also we can use this by comparing it to somebody else. Petrarch's works, right? And Dante's works. The Divine Comedy, if you will, right? Let's use Divine Comedy. Actually, you can ignore Petrarch right there. You don't really need to write this down. You can ignore Petrarch completely on that. We're going to go Dante instead because it's going to be a little bit better. Divine Comedy, handwritten. So, big thing about it, though, is you have to understand is that early on during the Renaissance period, when Dante was writing his stories, whenever, Petrarch was writing his poems and stuff like that, the thing about it was all the books that they were writing had to be literally handwritten, right? So this right here is a map, right, of the 9 circles of hell and the subcircles within those circles. It's a map of hell. It's all part of the Divine Comedy, the observations he's seen, the artwork inside of it had to be done by hand, and they made these books very, very expensive. So it meant that their reach was not very, very wide. Same thing with Petrarch's Ascension of Mount Venus, or any of the things that he wrote that were translations of Roman works. He actually could not get the word on those things out very fast because it all had to be handwritten. But Erasmus, on the other hand, Sir Thomas More, on the other hand, Christine Pizan, on the other hand, their books spread super, super quickly. The reason why is because of the printing press, right? Now, the printing press was developed around 1444, right? About 1444, about 100 years after Dante's Divine Comedy was already written. You see what I'm talking about here? Dante's work spread slowly, but then these other works by Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, Machiavelli, The Prince is going to spread really, really fast because of that printing press. The printing revolution, as it's actually referred to, is a very, very important facet when it comes to Renaissance technology, okay? The thing about it, though, is that we also need to talk about really briefly is that this is not actually a European technology first. The Easterners had already figured out how to make printing presses hundreds of years before the Europeans did. But we already knew stuff like that, right? The Easterners all the way back during the monsoon marketplace were selling and trading things like silks and spices and developing geometry and mathematics and doing all this other really intense stuff while the Middle Ages were going on. So of course they would also invent a simple printing press. The technology that existed for the printing press was originally developed by the Koreans and the Chinese, but it wasn't as good as European models, mainly just due to the fact that the Asian designs were made of wood. Mostly just due to the fact that lumber was much more of a prevalent resource in Asia, and most of their metal deposits were buried deep below ground. Whereas in Europe, some of the metal deposits, particularly iron, are actually much closer to the surface, so Europeans had more access to them. So when the printing press finally gets developed in Europe, it was actually made out of metal rather than being made out of wood. The wood types on a lot of these Asian designs would actually soak a lot of the ink up and actually make it so the types kind of fell apart really, really quickly. The metal type printing press, on the other hand, though, was invented by a very famous man. His name is Johannes Gutenberg, right? Now, the thing about it is, though, in general, Gutenberg did design that press. He did the metal Smith type printing press, right? Movable type printing press. Notice I have type in all capital letters right there because of what it is. How many of y'all in the house have ever played Scrabble? All right, I see y'all. I see what's her name? Zajac. I see your hand up over there. I see Worcester. Yeah, Worcester's hand right over there. Yeah, I'm just trying to learn y'all's names. So Abby, I see you in the back. You played Scrabble before. So the big thing about it is that's basically a type. A type is a square with a letter on it, okay? It's like you're playing Scrabble, if you will. And the way the entire thing works is they basically, Gutenberg, created squares, right, that each had the letters on top of them. And you could then just simply, by laying all those things out one at a time, if I wanted to put Mr. Terry, I'd be like, all right, I need an M, I need an R, I need a period. I need a T, I need an E, I need an R, I need an R, I need a Y. Then I'm going to put a space, and I'm going to put, like, is the worst teacher ever, right? And then I'm just going to, like, line all that stuff and go, print. I don't like how some of y'all probably shook your head yes at that. That's really, really hurtful because I'm literally bringing y'all candy tomorrow because we're going to look at art and pretty stuff and just hang out and, like, really, really kind of enjoy the products of the Renaissance together. Yeah. Remember that when I'm giving you something nice. Now, look, the big thing about it, though, is these little squares, you would just line them all up, and then you would just go, like, take a little maracas looking like little, like, they basically look like little brushes, and then you would just dab ink on top of it, and then go, whoop, whack, and then you would just, like, print it. Now, think about how much faster that is than actually handwriting something. Think about how much cheaper it's going to be than handwriting something, okay? And on top of everything else, it's not going to degrade quite like those, like, wooden-type printing press with the Asiatic designs did. Also, fun little fact, it's also where we came up with a very, very famous word in, like, certain languages. Whenever you're talking about print shops in general, they would actually keep capital or larger letters in an upper case above the ground, and all the smaller letters, the non-capital letters, were kept on that lower case. Hence, uppercase and lowercase letters in the print shops that began popping up all over Europe during the printing revolution. And on top of everything else, the Europeans kind of hint the printing revolution at just the exact right amount of time. Because the paper making process that had spread from China through Muslim, like, countries and territories on pulping up wood and then creating paper based on an ancient Egyptian design made its way through Spain. So paper making became much, much more important and also much more accessible in Europe. See, sometimes I get a little ahead of myself. I just need to slow down. Paper became much more accessible during the printing revolution, which meant that now that we have more paper, we don't have to go into the deep, dark cellars inside these churches anymore and scrape off Roman writing and then write on top of it. We're moving away from that now. We're creating new paper. That process has finally made its way into Europe. It's actually a really, really cool little, like, system where you basically just pulp the wood up and then you take a wire mesh screen, like this Muslim person is actually showing you in this documentation. This is how a Muslim, like, this is an instructional manual on how to make paper for a Muslim, like, university. And so this design and idea is going to shift its way, though, over to Europe through cultural diffusion up through Spain because the Muslim empires actually took over that big chunk of southern Spain. But you take a wire mesh screen, you dip it into the water to get all that wood pulp on top of the screen, and then you just press the water out of it, and then you lay it out to dry, and that makes your paper, right? And it does it very, very quickly. And because of paper making process, upper and lowercase letters, movable type printing presses, and books now being cheaper, literacy is going to begin to explode during the Renaissance, and it's another big reason why the Renaissance is referred to as the period of rebirth and growth of intelligence. It's kind of like all the things happen at the exact right time, right? Printing revolution, higher economics, more money coming in, paying people to be smart, right? Like, so all these different things, paper making is all going to come together at the exact right time, right? In the wake of really, really big tragedies that happened during the late Middle Ages. Books were Books were no longer made by monks and nuns. All right, they were now made by monks, nuns for the really expensive collector ones that were still handwritten, but also printers can now be making them as well. And the other big thing about printers is they opened up print shops all over Europe. The print shops also are going to become big propaganda centers. Big thing you need to go ahead and jot down real quick. Print shops become really, really big areas of political dissidence, right? If you wanted to get the word out about something, and you didn't want to be found out, but if you wanted to spread the word that might make your king mad, you use a print shop to do it, right? Because you could actually make pamphlets for very, very cheap, and they got around really quick. The idea, though, that you need to understand is the action of printing is very, very important. And the revolution of printing and making cheap books is very, very important because it's going to spread literacy during this time of rebirth and regrowth. The thing about it, though, is Gutenberg himself is not that important, mostly just due to the fact that somebody was going to develop this metal-type moving printing press eventually at some point or another. And then also, the other big thing you need to understand is between the time of the 1400s moving all the way up into the modern era of European history, 8 to 20 million books were going to be printed within 50 years of the printing press just being developed, which is more than had ever been produced in Europe up to that point in its entire history. 8 to 20 million books in 50 years, more than they had ever made in just 50 years, right? That right there should give you an example of how big of a deal the printing revolution was. And we're going to talk a lot about how the printing press and how all these different things are going to lead to the growth of economics and how the printing press will be related to the Reformation and things like that a little bit later on. But I'll see y'all tomorrow. Get ready to just come in, enjoy yourselves, and we're going to look at art and talk about some pretty stuff for a while. It's going to be a very relaxed day, and we're going to have that some little snacks and stuff like that. Just kind of enjoy it right before we go to lunch. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.